be very great, and it seems really, too, to have deep roots in the American psyche. What do you think the basis for this is?
Well, from my perspective, I think it's been a kind of conditioned reflex that's been building up in this country ever since the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, 1917, 1918. There may be some legitimate reasons why people object to communism, but I think the broad kind of fear that we have, in my view, is a conditioned reflex that sort of covers up what our own country's been up to during that period. It seems to me it's pretty obvious that the rationale of the American government for pushing through more and more money to buy weapons, you know, the influence on Congress, is the, quote, fear, military fear of the Soviet Union.
Actually, there are two, as far as I can see, there are two forces in the world that are attempting to carry out the, in my view, quite ludicrous attempt to identify the Soviet Union with communism. One is the Soviet leadership itself, which is trying to exploit the positive image of the egalitarian communist tradition for their own benefit. And the other is the United States, the American propaganda system, which also would like to undermine that egalitarian vision by associating it with Russian totalitarianism. But I don't think that we should, and you're right, I mean, this leads to a situation in which the values of the egalitarian socialist tradition, the libertarian egalitarian socialist tradition, are associated in the American mind with the brutal and repressive Soviet state, which in my view has nothing whatsoever to do with communism or anything, no connection with it. And these things, I think, very much should be dissociated. So I wouldn't think that, for example, I think the American people have very good reason, or everyone has good reason, to fear the Russian state, which is a violent and repressive and brutal autocracy.
No, I don't know that we should spend our time trying to argue about the definition. I would agree with Noam in a pure sense, but I think in practical political terms, there still is seen as a threat of Soviet communism in terms of American military and foreign policy.
Yeah, you're right, but I think we have to separate out the various strands in that threat. It's perfectly true that the United States, or at least, you know, the American leadership and the American ideological system have been very strongly opposed to what they call socialism. But of course they're opposed to many other things too. For example, they've often been opposed to fascism. You know, we went to war with fascist states. They were opposed to national capitalism in Europe. I mean, the United States has been opposed to democracy. For example, we were opposed to democracy, to a New Deal-style regime in Guatemala. And in fact, there's a general principle of which the opposition to so-called socialism is just one special case. Namely, the United States is opposed, naturally, to any attempt on the part of any society to use its resources for its own purposes, instead of to integrate itself into what we call an open world system, which means a system that's open to American economic penetration and political control. If any society deviates from that, whether it's capitalist, fascist, communist, you know, democratic or whatever, the United States will be opposed to it.
It's very handy to use the, quote, Soviet threat, or the phrase communist threat, to cover up the efforts to protect American hegemony everywhere in the world. We got some 2,000 bases all around the world. The Russians have nothing like that. If you came down from Mars, it would be, our country would be seen as the expanding power, but the American mindset is just the opposite of that. We see the Soviet Union, they're the threat out there, and we're sort of just minding our own business.
We've brought up now a number of times the question of life in the Soviet Union, repressive society. Various words have been used to describe it. Is this a given? In other words, are we all in agreement that the Soviet Union is a very repressive society? Dissent is totally stifled. It's authoritarian, totalitarian, absolutely no freedoms, you know, in that society. Is that an accurate perception?
I don't think it's a very difficult kind of question. If you're an ordinary worker, and you know, then things may not be quite so bad. But if you try to go beyond that, you run into a bureaucracy, you will run into all kinds of constraints on what you can do. If you're prepared just to be an ordinary John Doe and not cause too many problems, you may be all right. Because one of the things the Russians do, which is important to them, is to say there are a different set of rights in their country. It's a question of medical rights, whether the treatment is good or bad, has to be judged differently, but at least they espouse that. They say full employment.
Right.
Now, of course, there are some people who are unemployed. If you're a dissident, you can be unemployed, and then there's no unemployment compensation because by definition there's no unemployment, so what do you need unemployment compensation for? So for you, that can be bad. So in those areas, the Russians indeed are kind of, there's like a social contract which says we'll take care of your elemental economic needs. Now, we don't do that too well in this country, and one of the biggest strains that Russians keep throwing up to me is how can such a rich country like the United States tolerate unemployment? And that's not an easy question to answer, if there's an answer at all. But when you go beyond that, I mean, the Russian system is a very strict one, and you're not allowed much deviation. And if you want to step out of line, you're going to find that you're subject to all kinds of pressure, possibly jailing. It is not to say that things are free in this country, but in the Soviet Union there's much greater fear. If you go to visit somebody's home and they don't have authorization before, you walk in, you don't talk because they're feared that somebody will hear you speaking English or Russian with an accent. It's a very frightening kind of thing. So I mean that is a problem that exists and is real.
Let's say that every one of these criticisms has some validity. From my perspective, the nuclear arms race is just going to make matters worse. I mean, I think there's historical reason for the Soviet Union to be fearful of the West. There was, as I said earlier, there was the counter-revolution in the beginning. Then there was a whole period when we had the atom bomb. They didn't have it, and they felt they were being intimidated. A whole series of incidents where there is this fear of the West. And I would say that there could perhaps be a solidarity movement, as in Poland, in the Soviet Union in 15 years if we had genuine coexistence and detente, because I imagine Soviet workers, like Polish workers, are sort of fed up with the top-down stuff. So I don't know that we need to argue basically that most Americans would not like to live in the Soviet Union. And maybe you're a black teenager in Detroit out of work, it might look pretty good to be in a place where there's no unemployment and you can go to school without joining the army and so forth. But be that as it may, I would say that what the problem we've run into is the Soviet Union has been on the defensive, that the repression, the possibility of intervention along its frontier, all of that is aggravated by the American initiatives in keeping the arms race going. Because it seems to me the initiative of the arms race has come from the West from the beginning and continues to come from the West. And Mr. Reagan criticizes the Soviet Union for all perhaps the good reasons, but his policies, in my view, are almost calculated to reinforce and aggravate and make the situation worse.
Well, I think Russ has distinguished things properly that ought to be distinguished. On the one hand, there's the question of what kind of a society the Soviet Union is. And I think I doubt if either of us would disagree in any serious way with what Marshall just said. It's a highly repressive society which has a kind of social contract that puts a floor under certain kinds of suffering. Okay, that's the kind of society it is. Separate question is what kind of a threat it poses. Those are very entirely separate questions. I mean, you could have the most brutal, murderous society internally, which just wouldn't happen to be a threat outside. You could have the freest. In fact, through history, there has been no correlation that I can detect between the internal freedom of a society and its violence and aggression abroad. For example, England was the freest country in the world in the 19th century. And in India, it acted like the Nazis did. The United States is, in my view, the most open, politically speaking, forgetting social issues and so on. It's the most open and freest society in the world, and it also has the most brutal record of violence and aggression in the world. Now, these things are just uncorrelated. Now, if you look at the Soviet Union, it seems to me, yes, it is a repressive, and dissent is suppressed, and in my view, it's a dungeon. It's kind of a dungeon with a certain degree of social services. Now, and it is also a threat. It's a threat to the government. It's a threat to its own population. It's a threat to, in fact, anyone within its reach. But its reach doesn't happen to be very long. I mean, its reach is far shorter than we claim it to be. So for the population of the Soviet Union, for Eastern Europe, for Afghanistan, the Soviet Union is a real threat, and I don't see how anybody can question that. On the other hand, the United States has created the image of a Soviet threat just for the same reason that they create an image of an American threat as a way for us to justify intervention and aggression in our own domains. And in fact, if you look over the history of the Cold War, I think this is transparent. Take any incident of the Cold War, from the American intervention in Greece in 1947 up to today in Nicaragua, and you will find that every single time a Soviet threat has been created and usually fabricated to justify American intervention. And incidentally, they play precisely the same game.
We started off, though, talking about the internal system in the Soviet Union, the degree to which it's a repressive society, because that's certainly the perception of most Americans. But in what sense, if any, does that is that related to its behavior vis-a-vis other nations as well as its own people? Because, for example, I think many people believe you can't trust the Russians. They never abide by treaties. They never keep their promises. They're really not a nation like other nations. They're not part of the community of nations. They're a
How about
special
trying
breed.
this? The Russians don't keep their promises because they are a nation like other nations. In fact, the fact is anyone who believes the promises of any nation state is out of their minds or just doesn't know anything about history, and that includes us and every other one.
I think so.
I mean, you know, states follow their promises if it's in their interest to do so, and the point is to try to create a system of shared interest which will bring about a certain degree of observance through international agreements. Now, if we look at it that way, then it seems to me the Russian record is certainly no worse than ours.
In fact, it's pretty good in terms of arms control, because I think the Soviet government sees it's in its interest to observe those treaties, and the SALT I treaty, even SALT II, though Mr. Reagan insinuated the other day maybe they weren't keeping some of the SALT II provisions, even though it's not been formally ratified. I think both sides, you know, for pragmatic, prudent reasons, have been living up to it. I think Noam is absolutely right. In fact, Mr. Reagan right now is violating our solemn agreements to both the Organization of American States and the UN with this business in Nicaragua, which is just typical of how big power states operate. I would say that the Soviet position, just to argue a point, from the very beginning has been a defensive one, essentially, that they, from the very beginning, felt under duress from the West, that they insisted after World War II of occupying all those countries around their European perimeter, and they've been very tough there, as has been pointed out, in Czechoslovakia and Hungary. Afghanistan is on their frontier, and that along that line, there's no doubt that must to be criticized. We criticize the internal repression. But both of those things, I think, get confused in the American mind with this idea of a Soviet military threat to the United States. Because most of the arguments go back to Afghanistan, for example, or Poland, and I think you could admit all of the negative things and still argue that their whole position militarily has been one of reacting and responding to the West, even today. Their leaders say we will never first use a nuclear weapon, and Mr. Reagan says no. Mr. Reagan brings up the whole Star Wars concept now of outer space. They have been pressing against that. So I mean we should need to discuss this issue as to whether or not it isn't true that the threat and the initiative in the arms race has come from the United States rather than the Soviet Union.
But I don't think that's the only issue involved. I mean, but I don't, so the Russians indeed do tend to be defensive about their perimeter, although Afghanistan is again another issue. But I don't think it's fair to say they've only been concerned just about their perimeter. I mean, the best illustration in my mind was Khrushchev's attempt to put the missiles in Cuba. That, I think, Americans look upon as going outside. Now, that's not to say that we haven't done the same thing to them. It's a question of how do the Americans perceive it. In other words, the Russians are not innocuous. There's another problem involved, and that is that as concerned as I am about our military-industrial complex, I'm equally or even more concerned about the Soviet military-industrial complex because I think it's more powerful.
Let me just introduce a qualification. I don't agree with you about the Cuban Missile Crisis. I think that was a perfect example of a defensive move. And we maybe could go into that, but let's...
I don't know how you would define offensive.
Well, that's defensive, because in fact what the Russians were trying to do was to counter an overwhelming advantage in missiles that they knew that we knew.
Sure.
It was after Penkovsky. Well, maybe we should put that aside. But aside from that, I think your point is not only right, but it's exactly what we ought to be talking about. If you look at the history of the arms race, there's just no doubt that the United States had the initiative. But the reason for that, I think, is very simple. We're a more powerful and more technologically advanced country. So, of course, we're going to always have the more advanced military technology. Now, the important point that you made, Marshall, I think that I certainly agree with. You thought you were going to be isolated, but you're not. I think that the main thrust, the main pressure for militarization and the arms race in the Soviet Union comes from the internal dynamics of the society. I mean, I think once we dissociate our discussion from what, in my view, are kind of irrelevant considerations, like whether nations abide by states abide by their treaties and so on. No, of course they don't. And we ask ourselves, what is the concrete situation today? I think what we see is that the United States is deeply committed to a massive program of domestic militarization for the same kinds of reasons that drove it in 1961 and that drove it in 1950, and that have nothing to do with any perceived international threat. And we ought to understand that. If we want to know, I mean, I think it's very clear. I think it's you know, the Reagan administration the programs that the Reagan administration is following were in fact proposed in late 1978, but they couldn't be pushed through Congress at that time. Reagan extended them and accelerated them, and they're absolutely classical in the American system. When there is a domestic repression in the United States, when there's a domestic recession in the United States, you know, the standard reaction is to turn to the in fact, let me make it more general. Any modern industrial society has recognized since the 1940s that the way to deal with internal economic problems is through state intervention. I mean, the institutional structures of American society happen to be such that there is no coordinated state planning. Yeah. We don't have the system that they have in Japan, where there's a government ministry right. which deals with, you know, with highly centralized foci of industry and brings them together and makes a long-term economic plan. We don't have the institutional structure for that. We have a different institutional structure. Our institutional structure, as it's developed since the Second World War, is that the technique by which the government stimulates production is by creating a state-guaranteed market.
Another perception I think that a great many Americans have is that the goal of Soviet foreign and military policy is really world domination. And that's really what it's all about. And it's a fear that Americans have that this is indeed the goal of Soviet policy. Is this true?
I think that one of the misperceptions that Americans have is that the Soviet Union is just kind of like a vacuum cleaner running over one country after another. But they do the same kinds of things that big powers do that we've done. But that doesn't mean, again, that you can sit back and say, well, whatever they do is innocuous.
Well, look, I mean, the fact of the matter is that the Russians, in their international behavior, behave very much like any other power, including us. I mean, every power, great or small, tries to extend the influence of the extent of its degree to coerce and control and penetrate markets and so on and so forth, get resources. We happen to be the world's most powerful force. In the early post-war period, we were overwhelmingly the world's most powerful force, and therefore the United States did, in fact, we can easily document this both in the documentary record and the historical record, the United States did, in fact, set forth on a policy of global domination. And it succeeded to a surprising extent. Since that period, and the Russians did so also in their much smaller sphere. Now, since that period, this bipolar system has, in fact, eroded. I mean, other powers have developed, Europe, Japan, elements of the Third World, and in fact, the degree of the two superpowers to coerce and control us in our huge domains and them in their smaller domains, that has declined.
One may readily agree the Soviet system is totalitarian, but that there's a lot of illusions among ordinary Americans that if we go somewhere in the world, we're out to promote democracy. This is the Reagan line. I would say that from what I've observed living in Asia and in observing what's going on in Latin America, this is simply not true. This is another one of those rhetorical statements that helps to build up support for U.S. policy that should be challenged. That the Wall Street Journal had a report, an article urging U.S. corporations to invest in East Asia. And you know what the rationale was? It's a beautiful euphemism. Korea, Thailand, Philippines, they have firm political management. This rationale of the American mission in the world as being benevolent and democratic, I think that has to be also taken issue with.
Well, we could point out that again, it's quite general, every society perceives itself or tries to make its public perceive itself as benevolent. I mean, the British were carrying the white man's burden, and the French had a civilizing mission, and the Russians are doing their internationalist duty when they invade Afghanistan, and the United States is preserving democracy. And all of this, I mean, we are as much interested in democracy as the Russians are interested in socialism. In fact, we, over and over again have overthrown democratic regimes if they didn't do the kind of thing we wanted them to do. I mean, study after study has revealed the obvious, namely that American support and aid correlates essentially with the improvement of the investment climate. If a country is willing to open itself to our penetration and control, our access to resources, allow our corporations to repatriate profits and so on, we will support them. Doesn't matter what kind of regime they have.
Given what we've said about the goals of Soviet foreign and military policy, how do you how do you respond to the situation in Central America in terms of Soviet either influence or Soviet active involvement?
So, Tony, this discussion reminds me of, the standard joke about have you stopped beating your wife? I mean, there's a presupposition here which is so grotesquely false that even to answer your question is impossible. I mean, it's as if there was a discussion going on in the Soviet Union where they asked, what's the extent of American intervention in Eastern Europe? Well, okay, maybe they have discussions about that, and if we looked at them, we would laugh. I mean, okay, maybe there's some intervention in Eastern Europe, but that's not the problem in Eastern Europe. And the problem in Eastern Europe is Russian domination. Now, take a look at Latin America. I mean, Latin America has been subjected to American-supported, U.S.-supported terrorism and violence to a degree that is, unspeakable. Let's forget about history. In 1961, the Kennedy administration made one of the most important decisions in modern history, which almost nobody in the United States knows about. Namely, they changed the mission of the Latin American military from hemispheric defense, presumably against the Martians, to internal security, meaning war against their own populations. And that decision led to a spread of a plague of bloodshed and repression and torture and violence over Latin America that has no precedent in the whole bloody history of the continent. As country after country was turned over to national security states with a kind of a Nazi model, and I mean that quite literally, with constant American intervention and support. Now we look at that history, and then we ask, what is the extent of Russian intervention in Latin America?
One of the things, it's true that we've done all these other things which really deserve to be criticized. At the same time, we've done some other things which you simply overlook, which indeed are worthwhile. We have tried some economic aid, and in some cases
the Russians. Yes, for example, in Afghanistan,
yes.
The Russians have done some decent things.
Yes, they have. I don't deny that for a second.
Fine, what does that have to do with anything? If we're talking about Afghanistan, we talk about Russian aggression, not the fact that they have, on the side, done some decent things to try to win people over. Of course they do.
Sure, okay, but I mean, the point is that there was a view of Russian interference in Latin America and in South America itself against, in some cases, the legitimate regimes, which weren't always wrong. I mean, that these countries have problems. They have economic problems, and indeed any kind of society in the third world generally has problems almost by definition. They're not strong democracies. They've got economic growth problems, and they lend themselves to criticism and pressure on either side. And let me just raise one other thing that as Americans, we really do give our country a hard time, deservedly so for the most part.
I wish that were true. What the problem in the United States is that we fail to criticize American policy. The amount of real critical analysis of American policy is minuscule in the United States, and what there is can never reach a mass audience.
One of the perceptions that is being suggested at the present time is that that one way to demonstrate that the Soviets do have as a goal in their foreign military policy world domination is the size of their military, that it's not just a defensive type military, it's also offensive. And in fact, we're told that the Soviets are really militarily superior to the United States at the present time. So what about the Soviet military? First of all, is it true, would you say, that the Soviet military capacity is superior to that of the United States at the present?
Ask the Joint Chiefs, who are asked that every session of Congress. Constantly they ask them, well, would you trade the American military system for the Russian military system? And the answer is a horse laugh. We should tell the truth about the Russians. We should understand how repressive they are. We should understand how brutal they are and how aggressive they would be if they could get away with it, which they can't in most places. But if you look at the Russian military system, the fact is that its character is wildly exaggerated in American propaganda. And in fact, all of this has been exposed. It's been exposed over and over again, and the exposure has no effect. So, for example, take the way in which the United States determines the character of the Soviet military system. I mean, this is so farcical that people who know about it just laugh. I mean, what we do is the CIA calculates what's called the dollar equivalent of the Russian military expenditures. That means we ask, how much would it cost us to produce the Russian military system? And the answer is some huge number. The reason it's some huge number is that they're so hopelessly inefficient. I mean, that's a labor-intensive system, backward labor-intensive system. And for us to create a backward labor-intensive system would be extremely expensive. I mean, for example, if you ask the question, what would it cost, what's the dollar equivalent of the Russian agricultural system? Suppose somebody asked that. What would it cost us to duplicate the Russian agricultural system? Well, the answer is it would bankrupt us. You know, if we had to pay, 100 million peasants to farm inefficiently, it would just would bankrupt us.
No,
but we don't conclude from that the Russians are ahead of us in agriculture. Now, the fact is, suppose you were to ask, what is the ruble equivalent of the American military system?
Well, we do.
But you know what the answer is? The answer is that it's infinite.
Yes.
Yeah, because the Russians simply cannot duplicate our military system. If they could spend every ruble they have in Russia, and they can't duplicate our military system, it's just too advanced for them.
Well, at the very least, then, there's this adversarial relationship. Do either superpower want to change this? Or is each of them benefiting from this present situation? So much so that they're willing to escalate things even further.
I don't think either side benefits in any long-run sense, but I don't see any indication that either side is going to do something, take any unilateral action. It may very well be that the Russians could use the resources that are going to the military sector. They could certainly use them to, if they could be converted, which I don't think will be easy. So I don't see any, answer your question, I don't see any action at our level, I don't see any action at their level, and I think it comes, the motion that I do see is coming from kind of citizen activity, and I would only hope that there would be something comparable in the Soviet Union, and about that I'm not very optimistic either.
We cannot create initiatives in the Soviet Union, so it's pointless to discuss it. We can ask, what can we do here? Now, what we do here, if we want to be logical about it, has to be directed at two ends, at cutting down the American commitment to the arms race and at cutting down the Russian commitment to the arms race. And fortunately, the very same actions contribute to both of those ends. Now, just consider for a minute the dynamics of this system. We know that every time the Russians do something aggressive, it supports the hawks on our side, and every time they back off somewhere, it hurts the hawks on our side. And the system is mutual, it's symmetrical. So the fact of the matter is that the best way in which we can contribute to the reduction of aggression and militarism in the Soviet Union is by constraining our own militarism and aggression, which their hawks use, just as ours do, as a way of mobilizing their own populations. And in fact, my view is that's why the Cold War persists. In fact, it is highly functional for the more brutal and militaristic elements in both societies. It would also be helpful, we've pointed out, Marshall pointed out most strongly, and I agree with him, that one of the problems in the contemporary world is that there is no corresponding discussion inside the United States. Inside the Soviet Union, sorry. Yeah. And that's correct. And I think we ought to also recognize that what is a fact, that there is very little discussion in the United States. The spectrum of discussion in the United States is extraordinarily narrow. I mean, it's not narrow because the government comes and throws you in a concentration camp. It's narrow for other reasons. But, for example, well, the things that I just said a few minutes ago, which Marshall doesn't agree with, fine, that's his right not to agree. But the point is, the things I have said literally cannot be expressed to any large audience in the United States. There is no way for those views to be expressed to anything more than a marginal audience in the United States. So nobody stops me from getting up, let's say, at a college meeting called by a couple of students and saying these things. Mm-hmm. But everything stops me or anyone else who believes these things from approaching any large audience. Now, what that means is that, in effect, almost the entire discussion in the United States, and this is literally close to 100%, is within a very narrow framework of assumptions, and people who think that those assumptions are wrong, like me, simply have no access to any large audience.
Marshall keeps bringing up, well, I wish they had a movement comparable to ours. Well, given their history, given the fact they've never had any experience of popular democracy as we have with our voluntary organization, I think this is almost irrelevant. That's not going to happen in the same way. But on the other hand, from my experience there, which he agrees with, there's no denying that Soviet people across the board are fearful of another war. And I think there's been a lot of criticism of the bureaucracy. There are letters to the editor criticizing the bureaucracy. So if there was coexistence and there's pressure from the bottom for a more open society, wouldn't it seem reasonable that the government, as long as it doesn't feel threatened, would make some concessions to these pressures? To me, that is a common sense perspective. And I just wish that we had enough strength in our own system to move in that direction and away from this idea of name-calling and military threats. And it's a risk either way. I just remind us again, it's a risk either way, because each day that the present situation continues, there is a risk of war through accident. So let's take our risks on the basis of our own heritage and our belief in human beings as having this capacity to act reasonably in our own interest.